Thanks a lot, Massimo. Thanks a lot to Massimo and Indrek for the invitation. Apologies for not being there with you. It's a brave new world indeed. It's a strange world, but perhaps it's a world that we will manage to make more human, even if at a distance. I don't know, I'm just perplexed with the situation we have been living in the last months. My task today, my self-imposed task, but the task also agreed with the organizers, is to try to think about this coldest of all cold monsters that is the state by means of revisiting Bakunin's Statism and Anarchy. Bakunin was not a systematic thinker, that's clear. He was so full of sheer life that his mind tended to wander simultaneously into several paths. This helped enormously when it came to furious revolutionary action, but remains a source of frustration for many who approach his work as most political theories are studied, which still there is an element of the gospel. You look for the Bible into Hobbes, you look for the Bible into Locke. You look for a system, you look for ready-made answers. Those who approach him in such a way are confronted not only with morasses of fragments, but with pieces that seem to point into opposite directions. Attempts at introducing order into chaos have repeatedly failed. Maximov's very well known and heroic in many ways, the political philosophy of anarchism, scientific anarchism is the subtitle, is a highly useful yet doomed anthology of Bakunin's writings. The painful exercise of systematizing the writings of Bakunin produces an order that fails to reflect the structural fluidity of his thinking, basically a constant moving target by design. So what to do? Why Bakunin, if Bakunin is not a classical political thinker in this sense? Well, what I want to argue is that what seems at first sight a handicap is actually a major opportunity. Precisely because Bakunin did not want to offer a ready-made system, his work can be a spur to think not according to Bakunin, but with Bakunin, so to say. And in particular, his Statism and Anarchy, together and in view of other of his writings, we could say, seems to me to provide us with fundamental insights to rethink the state and the law in a rewarding manner. If that is so, it makes sense to explore Statism and Anarchy for the purposes of this collective endeavor that this workshop is, to try to draw themes with which we can, in the terms that I refer, think with Bakunin. What would I do now is essentially two things. First, I will try to highlight what, in my view, are elements that we still need to think, that still we need to go through, and that Bakunin put on the table in Statism and Anarchy. And in the second part, what I will try to do is to advance four themes on which I will try to think with Bakunin, not following Bakunin necessarily, trying to think through, trying to be loyal to the spirit, not to the letter, so to say, of Bakunin. So first, Statism and Anarchy. What is Statism and Anarchy? Because it's also, I insist at first sight, even if it's the only book that he actually published as such, the only book length thing that we have, is still not a systematic text. It's a text that is full of insights, but it needs an element of reconstruction, if you wish, or we can try to extract what are the main lines that are relevant in the book. If I am to do that, I would highlight the following. It contains a very intelligent reconstruction of the history of Europe since the French Revolution, with a special emphasis on the second half of the 19th century. It was written in 1873, just at the moment at which the rise of Germany, of the new German Empire, was visible to everybody to see after the defeat of France in 1871. And Bakunin tries to draw the main tendencies in European history, highlighting how the triumph of Napoleon marked the manipulation of the revolution and proto-national feelings, how the triumph of Bismarck was, in that sense, only the ultimate realization of what Napoleon had started in many ways. And there, the key element, the key tendency that he draws is the emergency of Germany as the only truly European state, the only really sovereign state in Europe, replacing France as the hegemon in political and cultural terms after the master triumph of Bismarck in 1871, with an unstoppable tendency to expand. And this is something that, with the benefit of hindsight of the whole history, so to say, up to the Second World War, is not at all a silly conclusion to draw. It can be said that in terms of what we could call a kind of long-term analysis of what was going on, Bakunin did not get it wrong at all. But there is even more to that. I will come back to that. But above all, I would say, from a historical point of view, is a reconstruction of European history, trying to see what are the main lines, the main tendencies within it. But it's also a work of what we could call political theory, not political philosophy, going back to the distinction that Hannah Arendt, that was invoked at the end of the previous session, drew between the two in terms of political theory. What we have here is the triumph of the state. And it's very important, it comes already in the title in many ways. It's not only the triumph of the state as such, it's the triumph of statism, of the state principle. So we could say, the state is the main manifestation of statism, but it's not the only manifestation of statism, very clearly. And that's a crucial point to draw home in many ways. What is the state? The state is basically, it boils down to institutionalized heteronomy. If the Enlightenment was about autonomy, the bastard child of the Enlightenment is the state, which is about institutionalizing heteronomy. And there are many brilliant quotations that I can draw from the text, but very obviously you have a characterization that has, for readers, that we have become used to thinking the state with the categories of Weber. There is an element of pre-Weberian analysis here of the main tools that the state uses in order to institutionalize heteronomy: the military, police, and bureaucratic centralization. And what is key in terms of his analysis is that he is not deluded by forms. He says explicitly, I'm quoting, "Any state, be it vested in the most liberal and democratic forms, is necessarily based on domination, on force, that is, on despotism, covert, perhaps, but all the more dangerous." And this is a classic locus, so to say, in terms of Bakunin thinking. Very obviously, is a key element, not only in the thinking of Bakunin, but in the thinking of anarchism in general. That is, what we many times regard as liberal democratic forms are cloaking institutionalized heteronomy, as I was saying. Now, the state is heteronomy, and consequently is also a machine of inequality creation. It's a machine that creates, by means of its action, by means of its purpose, so to say, even more inequality, socio-economic inequality. It's a source of blessing for a few thousand, for the happy few, and it's a source of misery for the restless many. That's also very well known. But it adds an element that I think it should be still stressed, that there is an imperialistic character by nature. So to say, the nation state as such is not necessarily the ultimate form of the state, because at the end of the day, there is only one or a very reduced number of really sovereign states, because there is this imperialistic tendency, this imperialistic trend inbuilt into the state. So some must emerge as the dominant, as the hegemons. And in his reading, it is Germany that is emerging in Europe as the hegemon. And moreover, and this is well known, but it's also worth stressing, with the state comes a statist frame of mind. A little state is, through education, through propaganda, is built into the minds and hearts of individuals. Is part of a type of culture, so to say. So the social instinct is replaced by means of education into the state instinct, which is a domineering instinct as such. That's, with some nuances, so to say, the kind of depiction that he makes of the state. There is a less highlighted element that is coming into Bakunin's reconstruction about other trends that are at work, and I think are essential to keep in mind in order to think with Bakunin. That is what we will be doing in very few minutes. And I insist there are at least 5. In his reading of history, Bakunin is speaking, much as Marx was doing, but in a different way, of the progressive role of the bourgeoisie, as long as it aimed at breaking with the ancien regime in the search for the rights of criticism, religious freedom, and financial control, which make them place liberalism against statism. So he detects this element of a genuine thirst for freedom that was at the origin of the liberal revolutions, and that disappears the moment in which they become stabilized, the moment in which Robespierre first and Napoleon then appear and then reinstate a different kind of tune, so to say, into the process of the bourgeois revolution. And then hope is lost. It has mutated into something different. But there is a progressive element originally into it, and it's not neglected by Bakunin. In the same way, even if liberal constitutions end up being the cloak of power and of heteronomy, they are not only tricks and smoke screens which hide the actual enslavement of the masses. They are insufficient documents, but they are basically so because they remain paper promises, not because of the contents of the constitutions necessarily. So there is not an element of simply rejection. There is an element of what is the reality, what are the facts regarding what happens with the constitutions. In terms, for example, of the polemics of post-war Europe, there is an element of this discussion about the fact that the constitutions remain non-acted upon, so to say. The third is the positive reading that Bakunin makes about changes in socioeconomic structures, such as trade liberalization, which might be surprising that he's seeing it as a progressive force. In the same way, technical development. He's thinking about planes in 1873, that they will broaden the mind in many ways. They will allow more connection, more human connection between different polities, and this is a positive development. The same with trade. The more trade there is, this is a positive element. And of course, there is a very positive reading, even in a very anti-German book, even in a German in a book, Prejudice Against Germany, that Statism and Anarchy, there is a very positive reading of German philosophy. So Kant, very especially, stands out as very problematic, perhaps in his political writings, but in terms of the structure of the thinking of Kant, and we can read into what Bakunin is saying very obviously, the whole move with the metaphysics and with morality in terms of the search for freedom and in terms of trying to liberate from the dead weight of the past and the dead weight of the old metaphysics. There is a positive reading that Bakunin makes. Now, what is very well known, and I don't have to dwell into that, is that there is an element of destruction, and there is an element of loading, of commending destruction, of the creative power of destruction that is involved into revolution. But there is also an element of construction and reconstruction, and this construction and reconstruction is essentially based on ideas. A popular idea is necessary, a general conception of one's rights, and a profound, passionate, one might say, religious belief on those rights. This is not an anti-intellectual, so to say. It's against intellectuals, but it's not against ideas as such that Bakunin is speaking. And I think this is something that tends to be caricaturized out of the analysis of his thinking. What are these ideas? I think there are several, but I will highlight here two that are relevant for what I'm doing in a minute. Of course, there is the element of the indissoluble relationship between political liberty and economic equality. The social question has to be put at the center. This is something very obviously, for example, you can applaud as much as you wish Kant, but the social question is not there in Kant at all. Very obviously, is simply not there, and this implies a choice for collective property and universal popular education. This is well known. I don't have to go into details. The second question, and that's key, is federalism, the downwards, upwards way of constructing polities, which is, as in all federal thinkers, a way of dealing with what we could call the Plato or the Rousseau question of the size of the polity. How is it possible to reconcile political freedom with bigger polities? And the answer, Bakunin is into the side of the answer to this question that stresses federalism. There are more questions that we could deal here, but I will only add one because time is running, and is who is the key political agent? And the key political agent for Bakunin, of course, is the workers, but contrary to Marx, is also the farmers. And key in the difference between the two is that he is interested about, or he makes a plea very obviously in terms of taking seriously the revolutionary capacity of the masses that are not indoctrinated, that had not the little state already absorbed, as he thinks, the most well-earning stratus, the most bourgeois stratum of the workers, which was very obviously was emerging in Germany, is. This brings him, and I will go back to that now in the second part, to a criticism of Lassalle and a criticism in a way of what will emerge as social democracy, as the progressive reform. He is into rupture. He is into breaking down with the past, not with reforming the past. So that's the picture I wanted to put on the table of Bakunin in order to stress the complexity of the thinking. There is not only an element of radical criticism, there is also the capacity to see tendencies, to see proclivities, to see elements with which you can construct this new socio-economic order that should be coming out of the destruction after the bankruptcy of the previous order. How to think with Bakunin? How to avoid the Maximov's mistake, so to say, of building a scientific anarchism, which is nonsense upon stilts in many ways. How to do that? I think we can basically do four things or take into account four themes that are key for the workshop. The first is to tackle the fundamental question posed in the title of the workshops, that is, to reconcile a radical criticism of statism with a nuanced approach to institutional structures, to the mass of structures that we call the state and the law. So, what is there still to be said about a state and the law? How can we take seriously what Bakunin is saying and still think about the state in 2021, so to say? Secondly, is how to extend statism and the radical potential of statism beyond the state, crucially to corporations, crucially to multinational corporations, either financial or financiarized. Thirdly, what to say about law. And fourthly, what to say about international justice, so to say, which in many ways is the only justice that there is once one takes seriously equality in a radical way. So, to start with the first, Bakunin affirmed once again that the state was the coldest of all monsters, and I have shown to what extent he considered that this was institutionalized heteronomy. The state was the ultimate realization of the statist principle, or what is the same of the principle of authority. Now, the Napoleonic and Bismarckian state was indeed the monster. But does it follow from there that any form of institutionalized authority is fated to become or to be a state in that sense, and therefore should be rejected as incompatible with any normatively demanding conception of freedom? That seems to me much less obvious. Bakunin criticized Lassalle. Bakunin criticized what we can now regard as the genuine social democratic idea of conquering the state and making use of it to steer step by step a transition towards a socio-economic, political, and cultural order in which equal freedom is finally possible. And there is a lot into that. But there is a different possibility, perhaps malgré Bakunin himself, if we consider his analysis of thinkers and political movements that have placed us on the road to freedom and equality. Moreover, and that is decisive, it seems to me that on the basis of the historical record since 1871, Bakunin's answer has to be qualified. I am very conscious that there have been many left-wing critiques of the post-war democratic and social state. I'm not denying, but rather the opposite, that there are many creeping, paternalistic, and authoritarian tendencies still built into it. And there is no doubt that some of the victories were real ones for white males only, or that they resulted from tactical concessions from the ruling classes. Still, it seems to me that this is not the whole of the story. With all its many shortcomings, the democratic and social state was, and is, but that would require justifying what it still is, a genuine material and normative achievement which transformed the lives of the many, that even if ambivalent in overall terms, advanced the cause of democratic equality or allowed to take the steps that were found to it. From the specific standpoint of this October 2021, when the owl of Minerva might be again spreading its wings at the dusk of the democratic and social state, it seems to be equally pressing, equally precious, to be conscious of the achievements and of the shortcomings of the democratic social state, of the two at the same time. And on the achievements, universal health care, paid holidays, universal pension systems, public libraries, or for that matter, the nationalization of central banks, cannot be reduced to mere acts of window dressing. They were achievements of the democratic and social state that, as Lassalle argued, implied changes in the power structure of society brought about by means of conquering or colonizing the state, or perhaps more realistically, using Habermas' metaphor, by laying siege on it, by means of exercising democratic force to change the program according to which the state operates. Allow me to reiterate, real social conquests were achieved not least because the power of the state was used not to enhance the power position of the powerful, but through democratic force, to weaken the violence with which they exerted their privilege. This process, I would venture, something radically important, but perhaps largely unnoticed happened. The Bismarckian authoritarian state was not disappearing, but something else started to emerge in parallel, so to say, something else that perhaps we can still call the state, but with points partially, insufficiently, all that you want to say, but in a significant and relevant manner, to a different type of commonwealth, to a different relationship to the common good. The welfare advisor and the teacher may be authoritarian, even racist, but the National Health Service and the public school, not in the British sense, of course, public school, the real public school, are something else than mere palliatives. They can rightly be, modo kropotkiano, as in the conquest of bread, be regarded as bits and pieces of a different way of organizing society. But if that is so, our assessment of the state as the coldest of all cold monsters have to be adequately adjusted. This is the first. I could go into this. There is also the whole process of the reconstruction of the states in post-war Europe. The strange metaphor of Millward of the rescue of the nation state that hides the extent of the transformation. But there is no time. I have to go to the second point. I hope that the first point was made clear. Something happened. Something changed. And something may be in the process of disappearing, but we have to be able to rethink about the possibilities, about the tension, the conflict between what Bakunin and Lassalle were saying in light of these developments. Keeping all the time Bakunin on the back of our minds because the imperative to avoid any kind of creeping back of heteronomy clearly is essential. The second way in which we may think with Bakunin is specular to the first, and indeed implies a movement in the same direction than the first. Statism, the principle of unconditional subjection, is not limited in its manifestations to the state. Historically, quite obviously, religious institutions were also manifestations of this principle, the church, God. Bakunin wrote abundantly about that, but he was interested in not getting distracted in the process. As things stand in the summer of 1873, he says that religion should not be the main concern. The state should. But in the same way, we could say that our main concern should not be this strange, mutating state, but it should be something else that represents even more the statist principle, that is the multinational corporation, as I was saying, financial or financiarized. Because obviously they are creatures of the state. They are created by the state. The juridical law of the state is the legal code which makes them possible. But they have acquired, and I don't have the time to go into that, but they have acquired, especially from the 70s, powers, capacities, prerogatives that makes them the coldest of all cold monsters right now. Because they mix or they combine elements of what used to be public prerogatives with private power without transparency and without accountability. If this is so, then this is a second reason to revise how we approach, how we relate to the state, because there is another monster there, and the hope of taming this other monster requires that we institutionalize the collective. It cannot be the Bismarckian state that is checking the multinational corporation. They are twin brothers. But we need an institutionalized public, an institutionalized commonwealth, if we want to check the multinational corporation. And I would add, we need something that is able, downwards, upwards, as you wish, but that goes beyond what we call, we tend to call the national borders, which means international integration one way or the other, internationalism, as I would say in a minute, in order to tame that coldest of all cold monsters, that is the multinational corporations. There are many other things that I would like to refer, even with concrete examples, for example, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Uber, that are this type of monsters that I'm thinking about, and how the democratic and the social state could curb them. But time is flying. I have to go to the third point I wanted to make. And the third point that I want to emphasize is about the law. Bakunin speaks about juridical law. So his attacks are not against law, are against juridical law. This means there is the possibility of a different type of law. There is the possibility of thinking about an institution that is not the embodiment of heteronomy. And very obviously, one can say that what is in the air is the incomplete, the insufficient move, for example, made by Kant in that regard as the law of freedom. It is one possibility that we can explore. Then Kant himself was acting as the subject of the ruler of Prussia, and he was not. He was in favor of the French Revolution, but what he was writing was extremely cautious. So the concrete political writings of Kant are one thing; the potentiality in Kant's movement are a different thing. How can we try to regain this potential? How can we try to think a law that is not juridical? And there are many things that could be said on that, but I would only say extremely briefly only two. The first is what is the main function that we are thinking that the law discharges. And very obviously, juridical law is about repression. The criminal law, the sanction, the brutal violence that the law can exert is at the center. And this is what dominates the way in which we understand the law. If we want to think law differently, we have to put at the center the basic social function of integration of society, that is the coordination of action in order to achieve collective goods. And I think this move is something that already characterizes the development of legal theory in the 20th century. It's very clear already, for example, in Hart and the concept of law. It's also very clear in McCormick. It's an incomplete movement, but we have to rethink what is the central function and how to think about the role of law in society. And in the same way, I think that the way in which we think about the legal categories keeps on being, and European law is a clear example on that regard, focusing on the subjective right to private property. But this is not the only fundamental right position. Other types of rights, other rights, show the clear interdependence between subjective rights, and collective goods. And it's high time we think about rights, not from the perspective, not through the lenses of the right of private property, that is radically asocial, is the right of use and abuse, but through the lenses of other rights. Finally, just in 30 seconds, international justice, which is the only justice that there is in many ways. Now, here, I think that the key insight that we should retain is that we have not to recreate, as liberal cosmopolitanism, in quotation marks, basically points to another center of power, that the objective of taming, for example, multinational corporations is not to create an even bigger monster. The objective is how to pull the resources of public institutions so as to be able to build them in a federal way. I think that, and it survives in the anarchist tradition, the original understanding, so to say, of federalism as something that is not justifying, as many times happens and has happened in the history of states, in the history of the United States, in the history of the European Union, is not an instrument in order to justify, to cover the absorption of competencies by the center, but is in order to guarantee diversity. And this element of diversity, of the complex reconciliation of diversity with the pooling, the creation of a general will, the pooling, the creation of a center, is something that is a major challenge that we have to think through, and on which I think it is very important, again, to keep Bakunin in the back of our minds. I hope it was not too chaotic, and with this, I conclude, and I thank again the organizers for the opportunity to be with you.